A woman had just endured one of the most brutal, personal, and humiliating public attacks in the nation's history. Opposing newspapers had dug into her first marriage, seizing on a legal error in her divorce papers to parade her as an adulteress who had run off. They called her a whore in headlines. At that exact moment, her husband, the man she loved, had just been elected president of the United States. She was about to become First Lady, and a grand inaugural ball was being planned in her honor. She had purchased a pristine, elegant white dress for the grand occasion. A few weeks later, she would wear that dress, not to the inaugural ball, but to her own burial. This is the story of Rachel Jackson, the wife of Andrew Jackson. She was the first lady who never was, a woman whose personal trauma became a political weapon for an entire nation. The story begins on the wild frontier of Tennessee in the late 18th century. This was not the America of powdered wigs, philosophical salons, and polite society that we imagine in revolutionary Philadelphia or Boston. This was the other America, the one of mud, blood, and constant pressing danger. Rachel Donelson was born on June 15, 1767 in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. But this was just a starting point. Her world was the absolute bleeding edge of civilization. Her father, Colonel John Donelson, was a man of significant, if restless, stature. He was a surveyor, an explorer, a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, and a man utterly obsessed with the promise of the West. He was not a simple frontiersman. He was an architect of expansion. He had worked with George Washington on early land ventures and was a man who saw opportunity where others saw only wilderness. He was one of the co-founders of Nashville, a name that would one day be famous, but in the late 18th century was just a patch of land on the Cumberland River, surrounded by thousands of miles of hostile territory. Rachel was one of 11 children. In this environment, a woman's education had nothing to do with grammar, poetry, or French. It was about survival. A woman was taught to manage a sprawling and often threatened household, command slaves, process game, spin cloth, load a rifle, and defend a homestead. Crucially, she was taught to ride. Rachel was known her entire life as an expert horsewoman. She was described in her youth as vibrant, beautiful, and captivating, with a personality that drew people in. But formal schooling was a luxury the frontier could not afford. Her surviving letters are a testament to this, filled with phonetic spellings and grammatical errors. This lack of polish, this backwoods quality, was a fact that her future enemies would seize upon. They would use it as a weapon, painting her as an unrefined, ignorant woman, unfit for the White House. What they missed or chose to ignore was her strength. They mistook a lack of polish for a lack of character. They did not understand what it took to survive the world she was born into. In 1779, when Rachel was just 12 years old, her father, John Donelson, decided to move his entire family, along with a massive party of settlers, to the new Cumberland settlements in Tennessee. This was not a journey by covered wagon over a dusty trail. This was a perilous near 1,000-mile odyssey by flatboat, down the dangerous and winding Holston, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers. This journey, known as the Donelson flotilla, was a nightmare. It was an armada of around 30 crude flatboats, or arks, carrying roughly 600 people. From the moment they set off, they were a floating target. The territory they were passing through was controlled by Chickamauga and Cherokee warriors, led by the indomitable dragon Canoe, who had rightly seen the settlers as invaders and had sworn to drive them out. The flotilla had to run a gauntlet of constant harassing gunfire from the shore. The journey was a litany of horrors that would be burned into the 12-year-old girl's memory. One boat was cornered, and its occupants were massacred. On another boat, the good intentions, a smallpox outbreak occurred. It was forced to lag behind the rest of the flotilla to avoid spreading the infection. As it fell back, it was attacked. Its passengers, men, women, and children already sick and dying, were either killed or taken captive. Rachel Donelson, a young girl, floated past the wreckage she witnessed this horror. She learned, in the most brutal way possible, that life was fragile, that the world was full of unthinking, sudden violence, and that danger was a constant companion. When they finally arrived at the settlement, what would become Nashville, it was no paradise. It was just a collection of crude log cabins and forts. Like Fort Nashboro, danger was a part of daily life. The indigenous tribes fighting for their ancestral lands launched raids that were both constant and terrifying. People were killed just outside the stockade walls. In 1786, her own father, Colonel Donelson, was murdered. The circumstances remain murky to this day. Some said it was an ambush by indigenous warriors. Others whispered it was White River pirates, or even a rival over a land dispute. For Rachel, now a young woman, it was just another confirmation. The world was a place of sudden, violent loss. This was the woman, tough, resilient, wary, and forged in trauma, who at the age of 17 entered into her first disastrous marriage. In 1785, Rachel married Captain Lewis Robards, a wealthy landowner from a prominent family in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. On paper, it was a respectable, even advantageous match. In reality, it was a prison. Robards was a man of uncontrollable pathological jealousy. He was, by all contemporary and historical accounts, a classic abuser. He would fly into paranoid rages, accusing Rachel of infidelity with any man who so much as looked in her direction. He watched her every move, questioned her every word, and created an atmosphere of pure terror in their home. The irony of the situation was sickening. While Robards obsessed over Rachel's imagined indiscretions, he himself was notoriously unfaithful. He allegedly carried on affairs within his own slave quarters, a hypocrisy that was not lost on his wife. For Rachel, this life was a living hell. She was a woman of deep, abiding Presbyterian faith. Her piety was not for show. It was the core of her being. She was devoted to her Bible and her religious poetry, and she found herself legally bound to a man who was both a hypocrite and a tyrant. In the 18th century, a woman had no legal recourse. She was, in effect, her husband's property. She tried to make it work. She endured. But in 1788, after a particularly violent fit of jealousy, she couldn't take it anymore. In an act of profound courage for the time, she left him. She fled Robards and returned to her mother's home in Nashville. Her mother, Rachel Stockley Donelson, was now a widow, and like many respectable widows of the time, ran a boarding house to support her large family. Rachel, humiliated and frightened but free, moved into her mother's home, seeking refuge. It was in this boarding house, a refuge from a violent past, that Rachel's destiny would be irrevocably altered. In that same year, 1788, a new lodger arrived. He was a tall, gangly, red-headed young lawyer, newly arrived to serve as the district's prosecuting attorney. He was 21 years old, ambitious, and possessed a fiery temper that was already becoming legendary. His name was Andrew Jackson. This arrival was not a simple social call. It was an act of fate that would set 3 lives on an irreversible collision course. The boarding house, meant to be Rachel's safe harbor, was about to become the very place where her past and future, her abuser and her protector, would finally and violently collide. For Andrew Jackson, this was not just a fellow lodger. She was a woman whose distress triggered his deepest-seated instincts. For Rachel, this fiery, protective young lawyer was something she had never known, and their immediate, powerful connection would soon force them to make a choice that would define both of their lives and her reputation forever. The boarding house of Rachel Stockley Donelson in Nashville was not a palace, but it was a central hub of activity, a respectable lodge for the ambitious men passing through the new Cumberland settlements. When Andrew Jackson arrived in 1788, he was just such a man. At 21, he was the new prosecuting attorney, a position that required a man with a stiff spine and preferably a quick temper. Jackson had both. He was an orphan, his entire family wiped out by the Revolutionary War and its aftermath. He had been a teenage soldier, a prisoner of war, and had studied law in a rough-and-tumble apprenticeship. He was fiercely independent, intensely loyal, and carried a deep-seated instinct to protect those he saw as vulnerable, a direct result of his own brutalized youth. In this boarding house, he immediately took notice of Rachel Robards. She was not just a beautiful woman, she was a presence, vibrant, dark-eyed, and captivating. She was the object of much attention. But Jackson, with his prosecutor's mind and orphan's intuition, would have quickly sensed the shadow that hung over her. She was a woman in distress, living in fear, a refugee from a disastrous marriage. He heard the stories from the other lodgers. He heard about Louis Robards, the uncontrollable jealousy, the paranoid rages, the public humiliations, and it was not long before he witnessed it himself. Louis Robards did not let his wife go easily. He traveled to Nashville to reclaim his property, as he would have seen her. He arrived at the Donelson boarding house and was confronted with his worst nightmare, his wife living under the same roof as a charismatic, fiery, and unmarried young lawyer. Robards' pathological jealousy, which had previously been aimless, now found a specific and dangerous target, Andrew Jackson. He began to spread rumors, publicly accusing Rachel of improper behavior with Jackson, effectively creating the very scenario he claimed to fear. The tension became unbearable. Robards was a threat. Jackson was a protector. The two men were oil and water. Accounts from the time describe a volatile atmosphere. Jackson, who viewed any insult to a woman as a personal affront, appointed himself Rachel's defender. He reportedly confronted Robards, and the two men nearly came to blows. The frontier was not a place for subtle legal maneuvering. It was a place where honor was a matter of physical confrontation. Jackson, fearing for his own reputation as a public official and for Rachel's safety, finally moved to a different boarding house to try and defuse the situation, but the connection was already forged. In Jackson, Rachel had found something she had never known, a man who, rather than being the source of her fear, was willing to stand between her and the world. The situation escalated. Robards, perhaps realizing he was outmatched by Jackson's intensity, seemed to give up. He left Nashville, threatening, cajoling, and finally announcing his intention to file for divorce. In the late 18th century, especially on the frontier, this was a complex, messy, and exceedingly rare proceeding. A divorce wasn't a matter of signing papers at a local courthouse. It required an act of the legislature. In 1791, word reached Nashville that Louis Robards had petitioned the Virginia legislature for a divorce. The word that traveled down the grapevine, through letters and word of mouth, was that the divorce had been granted. For Andrew and Rachel, this was a moment of profound release. By this time, they were deeply in love. Jackson, seeing that Robards was still a threat and that his reputation was poison, decided to escort Rachel away from Nashville for her own safety. They planned to travel down to Natchez, Mississippi. This was in itself a perilous and scandalous decision. Natchez was then a remote, lawless outpost on the river, deep in Spanish territory. It was the frontier of the frontier, a place where people went to escape their pasts. For Jackson to travel so far with a woman who was not his wife was a significant risk, but in their minds, she was free. They were acting on the best information they had. In August of 1791, believing she was a free woman, Rachel Donelson Robards married Andrew Jackson in Natchez. The details of the ceremony are lost to history. It was likely a simple civil service, if one at all, common to the chaotic legal landscape of the Spanish-controlled territory. They returned to Tennessee and began their life together, settling on a plot of land that would eventually become their beloved plantation, the Hermitage. They were, by all accounts, blissfully happy. Jackson, a man who was fierce, often brutal, and relentless in his public life, was a different person with his wife. He was unfailingly gentle, tender, and adoring. He called her his dear heart, his beloved. She, in turn, was his anchor, the calm center of his turbulent world, the only person who could soothe his legendary temper. He was a man of grand, violent passions, and his greatest passion was his love for her. Then, 2 years later, the floor fell out from under them. In 1793, they received a letter that must have felt like a death blow. They learned the devastating, mortifying truth. Louis Robards had not been granted a divorce in 1791. He had only been granted permission by the Virginia legislature to sue for a divorce in a court of law. He had never completed the process. Whether this 2-year delay was intentional malice, a desire to trap Rachel, or simply a result of bureaucratic confusion, the result was the same. When Robards finally did complete the divorce in September 1793, he did so on the specific grounds that Rachel had deserted him and was living in adultery with another man, namely Andrew Jackson. The charge was, in the cold, hard letter of the law, technically true. For 2 years, Andrew and Rachel had been living as husband and wife, building a home, all while she was, in the eyes of the law, still married to Louis Robards. She was legally a bigamist. He was an adulterer. The moment they discovered this, they were horrified. This wasn't a rebellious act. It was a catastrophic legal error, a misunderstanding born of slow communication and the tangled, overlapping jurisdictions of the frontier. Their friends and community in Nashville, who knew Robards' abusive character, understood. They saw it as an honest mistake, a procedural nightmare. On January 17, 1794, Andrew and Rachel Jackson quietly, legally remarried in a proper ceremony in Davidson County, Tennessee. They did everything they could to make it right, to sanctify their union in the eyes of God and the law, but the stain would never wash out. That one word, adultery, would follow Rachel Jackson for the rest of her life. It became a loaded gun, sitting on the table waiting for Andrew Jackson's political enemies to pick it up. And Jackson gave them many enemies. He was not a man of compromise. He saw the world in black and white. You were with him or you were against him. And if you were against him, you were his mortal enemy. But his deepest, most volcanic rage, the rage that defined his character, was reserved for anyone who dared to mention his wife's honor. He didn't just argue, he dueled. Dueling was a common, if often illegal, way for gentlemen to settle disputes. But Jackson's duels were different. They were numerous, and they were often brutal. His willingness to kill for his honor, and by extension his wife's, was legendary. The most famous and most revealing of these incidents occurred in 1806. The man was Charles Dickinson. He was young, arrogant, connected to Jackson's political rivals, and widely considered the finest pistol shot in all of Tennessee. The dispute began, as many frontier conflicts did, over a trivial matter, a horse race and a forfeited bet. But the animosity quickly escalated. Dickinson, perhaps feeling emboldened by his skill, made a fatal mistake. He published a statement in a Nashville newspaper calling Andrew Jackson a worthless scoundrel and a coward. This was bad enough. But far, far worse, Dickinson had been heard in taverns and in public, making insulting, salacious remarks about Rachel, questioning her virtue and her husband's for Jackson. That was a death sentence. He challenged Dickinson to a duel. Because dueling was illegal in Tennessee, they met across the state line in Kentucky on May 30th, 1806. The terms they agreed upon were savage. They would stand 8 paces apart. This was a distance that almost guaranteed a fatality. Standard dueling distance was often 10 or 12 paces. 8 paces meant they were not dueling for satisfaction. They were dueling to kill. Jackson, knowing Dickinson's reputation as a marksman, decided on a chilling, cold-blooded strategy. He knew Dickinson would fire quickly and accurately, aiming for the heart. Jackson, a tall and thin man, chose to wear a heavy, loose-fitting coat to obscure the true location of his heart. His plan was simple. He would let Dickinson shoot first. He would take the bullet, hoping his coat would slow it. He would not fall. And then he would take his time, aim, and kill Dickinson. That is exactly what happened. The command was given. Dickinson fired instantly. His shot struck Jackson square in the chest. Those present saw a puff of dust from Jackson's dark coat and saw him stiffen, his left hand grabbing his chest. He was hit, and hit badly, but he did not fall. Dickinson, horrified and in disbelief, reportedly cried out, "My God, have I missed him?" Jackson, in agonizing pain, slowly, deliberately raised his own pistol. He took his aim. Dickinson, as the rules of the Code Duello demanded, had to stand and wait. Jackson's pistol misfired on the first attempt. Under many dueling codes, this should have ended the duel. Jackson didn't care. He recocked the hammer, took careful aim again at the terrified Dickinson, and fired. The shot was perfect. It struck Dickinson in the abdomen, a wound that was almost always fatal in the 19th century. Dickinson bled to death. Hours later, Andrew Jackson walked off the field. The bullet in his chest had broken 2 ribs and lodged itself inches from his heart. It was too deep and too dangerous to remove. He would carry that bullet and the chronic agonizing pain it caused for the rest of his life. But in his mind, it was a small price to pay. He had defended his wife's name. This incident, more than any other, showed the world early on that the name Rachel Jackson was a subject best left untouched. It was a subject Andrew Jackson was willing to kill for, and a subject he was willing to die for. For Rachel, this must have been a complex terror. Her husband was her ultimate protector, but his protection was written in blood. Jackson's brutal public defense of his wife's honor had its intended effect. The duel with Dickinson was a message written in blood that effectively silenced local gossip for years. This hard-won, violent peace allowed them to retreat from the world and build the one thing they both craved: a private life, a sanctuary. It was in this quiet domestic interlude at their beloved Hermitage that the true Rachel, the pious, maternal, and private woman, could flourish far from the dueling grounds and political squabbles. But this treasured isolation, this sanctuary built on love and defended by violence, was never destined to last. Her husband was a man of ambition, and the nation would not let him rest. The message was clear. To speak her name with anything less than respect was to risk death. Andrew Jackson's unblinking, violent defense of his wife had effectively silenced the local gossip. During this period, Jackson's own star began to rise to a national and then international level. His exploits as a general in the War of 1812, culminating in the legendary nation-defining victory at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, transformed him from a frontier lawyer into Old Hickory, the savior of the nation, the new Cincinnatus. But this fame, this pull toward a public destiny, was entirely his, not hers. Rachel Jackson's life, her goals, and her entire world were centered on one place, the Hermitage, their beautiful plantation outside Nashville. This was her sanctuary, the world she had built, and the only world she ever wanted. While her husband forged a nation, she cultivated a garden. While he commanded armies, she managed a household. She was not a socialite. She was not ambitious. She was a quiet, introverted woman whose greatest happiness was found in domestic peace. Her life at the Hermitage was one of routine, faith, and family. As the mistress of a large and growing plantation, her responsibilities were immense. She managed the large household, oversaw the enslaved population that worked the cotton fields and ran the home, and cultivated her sprawling garden, which was her personal pride. This was the life of a frontier aristocrat, a role she had been bred for. Her faith was the organizing principle of her adult life. Her happiest and most peaceful hours were spent in her room, reading her Bible and her prayer books. She helped build the local church at the Hermitage. She hosted preachers, discussed theology, and found her solace not in the parties and political maneuvering of the new American aristocracy, but in the promise of the hereafter. This deep, abiding morality makes the legal mistake of her youth all the more tragic. She was, in her own mind and in the eyes of her community, a profoundly moral woman. Yet this technicality from decades prior, born of her escape from an abusive tyrant, lingered. This disconnect between the real Rachel and the public's perception extended to her personal habits. It was in these quiet years at the Hermitage that the corncob pipe habit became known. It was in fact true. She did smoke a pipe, often with her husband in the evenings as they sat by the fire. It was a common habit for women of the frontier, a relic of her pioneer upbringing, a practice that was rustic but unremarkable in Tennessee. But in the hands of political enemies, this simple habit would be twisted. It would be used as a symbol to paint her as low-class, mannish, unrefined, and wholly unfit for the polite society of Washington. They would take an image of domestic comfort and turn it into a caricature of vulgarity. Perhaps the greatest private sorrow of her life and Andrew's was that they could not have children of their own. The reasons are lost to history. Some speculate it was a result of the trauma from the Dickinson bullet, which remained lodged in Jackson's chest, or other frontier illnesses. For a man like Jackson, who craved legacy, and for a woman like Rachel, who was profoundly maternal, this was a deep and persistent emptiness in an era where family was defined by blood. Their inability to have their own children was a significant grief, so they built a family. Their home was constantly filled with children. Rachel, one of 11, had a sprawling network of siblings, and she became a second mother to many of her nieces and nephews, who often stayed at the Hermitage for long periods, but this was not enough. In 1809, they formalized their desire for a family. Rachel's brother, Severn Donelson, and his wife had twin boys. Shortly after the birth, the Donelsons were reportedly struggling, and Rachel, who had helped deliver the babies, formed a deep attachment. In an arrangement that was common at the time, Severn and his wife agreed to let the Jacksons adopt one of the infants. They named him Andrew Jackson Jr. and raised him as their own son and heir. He was, in every sense, their child. But the most unusual and perhaps most revealing member of their household arrived in 1813. In the midst of war, Jackson was not just a hero of the War of 1812. He was also the central figure in the brutal Creek War, a campaign against a faction of the Muskogee people. In November 1813, Jackson's troops, along with allied Creek and Cherokee warriors, fought the bloody Battle of Tallushatchee. It was a massacre. Jackson's forces overran the village and in the aftermath, a 10-month-old Creek boy was found on the battlefield, alive, clinging to his dead mother's breast. The other surviving Creek women, in their profound grief and despair, refused to care for the child, reportedly telling the soldiers, "All his people are dead. Kill him too." Jackson's soldiers didn't know what to do. Jackson, the man who had just orchestrated the slaughter of the boy's entire village, refused to let the child be killed. He had the infant brought to his tent, tried to care for him, and when he returned to the Hermitage, he brought the child with him. He wrote to Rachel, "He is a savage, but he is a human being, and I have taken him under my special care. I will raise him as one of us." They named him Lincoln. And in a stunning, uncomfortable contradiction, this indigenous orphan, the last survivor of a village his new father had destroyed, was raised at the Hermitage. He was not a servant. He was raised as a son, alongside Andrew Jr. Rachel. Far from seeing a savage, saw a child who needed a mother. She became that mother. She loved Lincoln. He was educated with Andrew Jr., and Jackson later wrote of him with paternal affection, even trying to get him an appointment to the West Point Military Academy. It is a historical paradox that is difficult to untangle. The man known as the Indian killer who adopts an indigenous son. But for Rachel, there was no contradiction. He was a child, and her home was his. His presence at the Hermitage speaks volumes about the complex private world she and Andrew had built, a world far removed from the public's gaze. This was the life she wanted, a life of domestic peace, family, faith, and the quiet rhythms of the plantation. She did not just dislike her husband's political ambitions, she dreaded them. She dreaded his long absences, the danger he was so often in, and the world of politics that she found so distasteful. When he was appointed military governor of Florida, she went with him and was miserable. When he became a senator, she briefly joined him in Washington and found the city's high society to be exactly what she expected: shallow, perfidious, and vain. All she wanted was to be home at the Hermitage in 1824. Her husband, the great war hero, ran for president. The election was a fractured four-way race between Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford Jackson. The man of the people won the popular vote. He also won the most electoral votes, but no candidate won an outright majority in the Electoral College. The election, by constitutional law, was thrown to the House of Representatives. The man who held the power to decide the presidency was the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, a brilliant politician in his own right, personally detested Andrew Jackson. He saw him as a dangerous, unhinged military chieftain, unfit for the office. Clay, having been eliminated from the race himself, now held the fate of the nation in his hands. He made his choice. He threw his support and the states he controlled to John Quincy Adams. Adams won the presidency in the House. A few days later, President-elect Adams announced his choice for Secretary of State, the most prestigious cabinet post and the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. His choice was Henry Clay. Andrew Jackson and his supporters were enraged. They screamed, "Corrupt bargain." They claimed with much justification that the will of the people had been thwarted by a backroom deal between two Eastern establishment politicians. Jackson, furious, resigned his Senate seat. He returned to the Hermitage, not as a defeated man, but as a man on a mission. He and his new political party, the Democrats, immediately began planning for the 1828 election. The corrupt bargain did more than just delay Jackson's presidency. It declared all-out war. The fragile truce that had protected Rachel's honor for 2 decades was over. As Jackson's populist movement became an unstoppable tidal wave, His desperate political enemies saw only one path to victory. They could not defeat the general on his record as a war hero. So they decided to attack his one known vulnerability, the private legal error from 35 years prior, a frontier misunderstanding, was about to be unearthed, twisted, and weaponized into the most public and most poisonous slander in American political history. The quiet life Rachel had built was about to be burned to the ground. This campaign is, to this day, considered one of the most vicious, personal, and dirty in American history. It was a new kind of politics, a gutter war, where nothing was out of bounds. And the personal lives of the candidates were considered fair game. The Jacksonian press was brutal, attacking Adams as an elitist, an aristocrat, and a pimp. But the pro-Adams press, desperate to stop the barbarian Jackson, decided to counter not by defending Adams's record, but by destroying Jackson's character. And the most efficient way to do that, they decided, was to destroy his wife. They unleashed hell on Rachel Jackson. This was not a subtle affair of whispers in Washington drawing rooms. This was a coordinated, public, and relentless media campaign. The man who led the charge was Charles Hammond, the editor of the powerful Cincinnati Gazette. He and other Adams men in the press decided it was time to pick up the loaded gun that had been sitting on the table for 35 years. They dug up the old, complex, and misunderstood Robards divorce, and they did not present it as a legal error. They presented it as a crime of passion, a tale of base lust and seduction. They printed pamphlets, editorials, and broadsides. The narrative they spun was simple, salacious, and utterly devastating. In their telling, Lewis Robards was not an abusive, paranoid tyrant. He was the innocent and wronged husband. Andrew Jackson was not a protector. He was a worthless scoundrel, a violent homewrecker who had seduced and stolen another man's wife and Rachel. She was the prime target. The old charge of adultery was just the beginning. It now metastasized. They branded her a Jezebel. They called her a common prostitute. They printed her name next to the words bigamy and convicted adulteress for the entire nation to read. They claimed Jackson had polluted the office of the presidency before he even set foot in it by tearing Rachel from her husband's arms. This was not a secret kept from her by a protective husband. Rachel, a reclusive 61-year-old woman, saw these pamphlets. She read these words. This woman, who had built her entire life on moral rectitude in her role as a matron of the community, was being branded as a scarlet woman for the entire nation. To see the humiliation was total and inescapable. She who spent her days reading her Bible was being equated with a back alley whore. But the attacks did not stop there. They were comprehensive, designed to paint her as unfit in every conceivable way. They attacked her very essence. They took the private letters she had written to friends, the ones filled with the phonetic spellings of the frontier, and published them. Newspapers printed them on the front page, allegedly with red circles drawn around the grammatical errors, holding her up for national ridicule. They portrayed her as an ignorant countrywoman, unfit to be the first lady of a sophisticated nation. They attacked her habits. The corncob pipe, that simple rustic comfort, was brought onto the national stage. In political cartoons and columns, she was mocked as a fat, dumpy old woman, smoking her pipe like a man, a symbol of her low-class, vulgar, and mannish nature. They attacked her appearance. Editors who had likely never seen her described her in the most unflattering terms, contrasting her with the refined, educated, and ladylike Louisa Adams, the current First Lady. They even attacked her family with racial slurs. In the most vile and desperate of the slanders, they circulated a completely fabricated rumor that Rachel's own mother, Rachel Stockley Donelson, had run a common brothel, and that one of her sisters was a mulatto. The effect of this unending, multi-year torrent of public shaming was devastating. Rachel was already in frail health. Since 1825, she had been suffering from what was then called phthisis and a pain in her breast. Today, her symptoms, shortness of breath, coughing, chest pain, and what was described as palpitations, strongly suggest she was suffering from chronic respiratory illness and, critically, congestive heart failure. The stress of the campaign, the public humiliation, and the sheer, unending venom of the attacks was a weight her weakening heart could not bear. She was not just a political target, she was a woman. She read the words and they broke her. She reportedly cried often, her anxiety escalating. She became a recluse at the Hermitage, her sanctuary now her only hiding place. And in the midst of this public hell, she suffered another more private loss that was just as profound. In June of 1828, at the very height of the vicious campaign, her adopted son, Lincoya, the Creek boy they had raised from infancy, died suddenly of tuberculosis. He was only 16 years old. The combination of this profound personal grief and the relentless public shaming was more than her heart could take. Her friends and family, including her niece and confidant Emily Donelson, watched her waste away. She became terrified of the future. She had no desire to be First Lady. She saw Washington as the source of all this pain, a Babylon of sin and slander. As the election results rolled in through the fall of 1828, confirming her husband's sweeping, triumphant victory, she felt no joy. She felt no vindication. There was only dread. Jackson's victory was a populist mandate, a revolution. For Rachel, it was a sentence. She reportedly told a friend in a quote that perfectly captured her state of mind, "I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to live in that palace at Washington." But she was dutiful. She loved her husband, and she would go. The nation had made its choice, and she was now the First Lady-elect. The Slanders, it seemed, had failed to stop Jackson, but they had succeeded with fatal precision in stopping her. In early December 1828, she gathered her strength and traveled from the Hermitage to the nearby city of Nashville. She needed to do some shopping, to purchase the clothes she would need for the inauguration, including a pristine white dress for the ball that would be held in her honor. It was there, in a Nashville shop, that the final invisible blow was struck. She was standing in the shop, a 61-year-old woman, exhausted, ill, and now the most famous woman in America. And she overheard two other women in the shop gossiping. They did not recognize her. They were repeating the most vile of the rumors about the new First Lady-elect, laughing about the adulteress who was now going to the White House. She heard them. She understood in that moment that the victory had changed nothing. The slanders would follow her, even to the palace. She stood, absorbed the final brutal insult, and collapsed. That collapse in the Nashville shop was not a simple faint. It was the sound of a body and a heart finally surrendering. The relentless, poisoned arrows of the campaign, which Rachel had absorbed for months, had finally found their mark. The slanders were no longer just words. They had become a physical, fatal assault. Rushed back to the Hermitage, the woman who had just been victorious in a national election was now in a desperate and final battle for her own life. As her husband, the president-elect, watched helplessly, the tragedy of their life was about to be sealed, and the victory they had won together would be rendered a source of ultimate agonizing pain. The collapse in the Nashville shop was the final, physical manifestation of a spirit that had already been broken. Rachel Jackson was rushed back to the Hermitage, her sanctuary now set to become her deathbed. Her condition was critical. She was, as her physician would later describe, suffering from a violent pain in her chest, shoulder, and left arm. To a modern ear, this is an unmistakable textbook description of a severe heart attack, a myocardial infarction. But in 1828, it was a terrifying mystery, a spasm of the heart, a suffocation of the vital organs. She rallied for a few days. Her iron-willed frontier constitution seemed to be fighting back. She lay in her bed, weak and in pain, but conscious. Andrew Jackson, the President-elect of the United States, never left her side. The man who was preparing to command a nation now sat in a simple chair, a sentry at his wife's bedside, holding her hand. He was utterly consumed by her suffering, sleeping only when he collapsed from sheer exhaustion, often in the same chair, still gripping her hand, as if he could physically tether her to the world. During this brief, fragile respite, Rachel seemed to understand what was happening. Her faith, which had been the source of her comfort in life, now prepared her for death. She spoke with her husband, not of the inauguration or the palace in Washington, but of her beliefs and her fear. She was, as one of her friends noted, more of heaven than of earth. She expressed a deep, unsettling premonition. She told a friend that she would never see Washington, that the people had given there to her husband, but that she had given herself to God. On the evening of December 22nd, 1828, just 2 days before Christmas Eve, she seemed to be improving. She was sitting up in bed, and her breathing, which had been labored, became easier. She urged her husband to go to the adjacent room and get some proper rest. He was exhausted, and he had to be strong for the journey to Washington. He was reluctant, but he obeyed. He kissed her good night, a kiss that would be their last. A few moments later, a terrible gut-wrenching scream came from her room. It was the voice of her maid, Aunt Hannah, one of the family's enslaved servants who was closest to Rachel. Rachel had apparently stood up, perhaps to be repositioned or to call for her husband, and had suddenly clutched her chest, letting out a single agonizing cry of her own. She then fell, lifeless. The final massive heart attack had struck. Jackson ran into the room. He found her on the floor, and he broke. The man who had faced down British cannons at New Orleans, the man who had taken Charles Dickinson's bullet to the chest without flinching, the man whose iron will was the stuff of American legend, was utterly and completely destroyed. He did not weep. He howled. He refused to believe she was dead. He gathered her body, the dear heart he had cherished for nearly 40 years, into his arms. He held her, rocking her, talking to her, begging her, "Rachel, Rachel, don't leave me." He refused to let her go. He laid her on the bed and insisted she was only in a faint. He demanded the doctors try to revive her. He pleaded with them, then commanded them. They were in the presence of not just a grieving husband, but the President-elect, a man of terrifying authority, and now a man in the throes of a grief so profound it bordered on madness. The doctors, to appease him, tried the common medical practice of the day. They bled her, opening a vein to try and stimulate her circulation, but there was no blood to draw. Her veins were already cold. Jackson stayed with her body all through the night. He would not leave. He would not accept it. He sat by the bed holding her cold hand, his gaze fixed on her face, searching for a sign of life, a flicker of breath that would never come. His friends and family, one by one, came in to pay their respects, and they found this tableau: the most powerful man in America, a virtual king in the eyes of his followers, rendered utterly powerless, clinging to the corpse of his wife. By the gray light of morning, the cold reality had set in. She was gone, and with her, the man Andrew Jackson had been was also gone. In his place was something else, a man possessed by grief and a burning, cold, and bottomless rage. Andrew Jackson was convinced his wife had been murdered, not by a person, but by the poison of politics. He did not see her death as a tragedy, he saw it as an assassination. The men who had written the pamphlets, the editors who had printed the slanders, the politicians who had encouraged them, they were, in his mind, her killers. He blamed his enemies. He blamed John Quincy Adams. He blamed Henry Clay. He blamed Charles Hammond. He blamed the entire corrupt establishment he had just defeated. He believed with the certainty of a religious zealot that they had known she was ill, that they had known her heart was weak, and that they had aimed their poisoned arrows directly at her, intending to kill her, or at the very least, to wound him through her. At her funeral, as he stood over her open grave, his grief finally boiled over into a public vow of vengeance. He was heard to say, in a voice choked with a fury that stunned the mourners, "May God Almighty forgive her, murderers, as I know she forgave them, I never can." The funeral was held on Christmas Eve, 1828. It was a dark, cold, rainy day in Tennessee. The entire city of Nashville mourned thousands of people, from the wealthiest landowners to the poorest frontiersmen who John elected him, trudged through the mud to the Hermitage. They came to mourn the general's wife, the woman they had known as a kind, gentle presence. Rachel Jackson was buried in the garden of the Hermitage, the place she loved most, just feet from the house. This was, as she had requested, to be her final resting place, and she was buried as she had wished, wearing the pristine white dress she had purchased in Nashville, the dress she had bought for the Inauguration ball, the dress she had been shopping for when she overheard the final fatal insult, now served as her burial shroud. Andrew Jackson was now a man, alone. He was the President of the United States. He was the most popular and most hated man in America. And he was completely, devastatingly broken. A few weeks later, he began his journey to Washington to claim the office he had won. But he did not go as a triumphant hero. He went as a broken-hearted old man, an avenger, a widower who saw the entire political establishment of Washington as his wife's murderers. He entered the White House, the palace Rachel had dreaded, in the deepest mourning, wearing a black armband of crepe, which he would not remove for the rest of his life. The inauguration, which was supposed to be his greatest triumph, became a symbol of his rage. After taking the oath of office, he opened the White House to the people. The result was a mob, thousands of his supporters. The unwashed masses poured into the executive mansion, climbing on the fine furniture with muddy boots, breaking china, and drinking whiskey, all to get a glimpse of their hero. The refined society of Washington watched in horror. They saw it as the reign of King Mob, the end of civilized government. But for Jackson, it was a fitting symbolic act. This was his house now, and the people who had slandered his wife, the aristocrats who had looked down on her as a vulgar backwoods woman, were now being physically pushed out of the way by the very common people they despised. It was his first act of vengeance. This shadow, the ghost of Rachel Jackson, would haunt his entire 8-year administration. His presidency was not just defined by his policies, like the bank war or Indian removal. It was defined by this profound personal loss. His hatred for his political opponents, especially Henry Clay, was no longer just political. It was deeply, violently personal. He believed they had killed his wife. Every political battle was, in his mind, another chapter in the same war that had claimed her. The most potent and bizarre example of this was the petticoat affair. It was a crisis that would define the first 2 years of his presidency, tear his cabinet apart, and create an irreparable rift with his own vice president. And it was, in its entirety, a direct, horrifying echo of the attacks on Rachel. Andrew Jackson's presidency began not with a celebration, but with a funeral. He entered the White House a broken man, a widower who saw the aristocratic vipers of Washington as his wife's literal killers. The ghost of Rachel was not a quiet memory. It was an active, vengeful force. He was a powder keg of grief, looking for his wife's murderers in every shadow of the Capitol. He did not have to wait long. Almost immediately, a new social scandal erupted among his own cabinet. And for Jackson, it was not a new fight. It was the same fight, a horrifying echo of the slanders that had just claimed his wife's life. He would not and could not let them win again. The conflict centered on Peggy Timberlake O'Neill, the new wife of Jackson's close friend and Secretary of War, John Eaton. Eaton had been Jackson's campaign manager and one of his most loyal supporters. Peggy was the daughter of a Washington, D.C. tavern owner, a place where politicians, including Eaton and Jackson, frequently lodged. She was vibrant, beautiful, and known for her sharp wit, and for being the subject of relentless gossip. The rumors had followed her for years. It was whispered that she was a woman of loose morals, that she was flirtatious, and, most damningly, that she had been carrying on an affair with John Eaton, while her first husband, a Navy purser named John Timberlake, was still alive. In 1828, while at sea John Timberlake died. The official cause was a respiratory illness, but the rumors insisted it was suicide, that he had killed himself in despair over his wife's infidelity with Eaton. Just a few months later, in January 1829, in the brief tragic window between Rachel's death and Jackson's inauguration, Eaton married the newly widowed Peggy Jackson. Still raw with grief, had personally urged Eaton to marry her, to stop the tongues of slander, and make an honest woman of her. He saw it as an act of protection. But Washington society did not. When Jackson appointed Eaton to his cabinet, the other cabinet wives, the elite hostesses of the Capitol, were appalled. They saw Peggy not as a cabinet wife, but as a tavern girl, an adventuress, an adulteress who had driven a man to suicide. The social war began instantly. The ringleader was Florid Calhoun, the formidable wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun. She, along with the wives of most of the other cabinet members, declared Peggy Eaton persona non grata. They refused to call on her. They refused to attend parties or dinners if she was present. When Jackson hosted state dinners, they would snub her, turning their backs. It was a public, coordinated, and humiliating shunning. Jackson, seeing this, did not react with political calculation. He reacted with a visceral, protective fury. He did not see a simple, petty social spat. He saw a direct, agonizing replay of the attacks on Rachel. He saw the same polite society vipers, the same aristocratic establishment, the same use of slander and social exclusion to destroy a woman and, by extension, a man he loved. In his mind, the women shunning Peggy Eaton were no different from the men who had printed pamphlets that had driven his wife to her grave. He took one look at the situation and saw his murdered wife. His reaction was uncompromising, almost unhinged. He called a full cabinet meeting, not to discuss the national bank or tariffs or foreign policy, but to discuss the virtue of Peggy Eaton. He reportedly held up a letter, his hand shaking, and declared to his cabinet that their wives' behavior was a plot to drive Eaton from the cabinet and, by extension, to control him. He told them in a voice of thunder that Peggy Eaton was as chaste as a virgin. He became Peggy's sole obsessive defender. He saw the attacks on her as an indirect attack on the memory of his wife. To accept Peggy's exclusion would be to admit that the slanderers could win. It would be a posthumous victory for the men who had killed Rachel. Jackson would not, could not, let them win again. This petticoat affair paralyzed the government. It wasn't just about etiquette. It became a test of loyalty. Jackson divided his administration into two camps, those who were for Peggy and those who were against her. He saw the refusal to socialize with the Eatons as a sign of political betrayal. The crisis created an irreparable rift between Jackson and his vice president, John C. Calhoun. Jackson, already differing with Calhoun on political issues like nullification, now saw Calhoun's inability to control his wife, Florid, as a deep, personal, unforgivable insult. The situation became so toxic that Jackson found it impossible to govern. Finally, in 1831, he found a way to end the war. His one loyal cabinet member, Martin Van Buren, offered a solution. Van Buren would resign, giving Jackson a pretext to demand the resignations of the rest of the cabinet. Jackson seized the opportunity. He fired his entire cabinet, a clean sweep, simply to purge his administration of the men whose wives had insulted Peggy Eaton. He then rewarded Eaton with a new post as governor of Florida, getting him and Peggy out of Washington. This was how far he would go. He would sooner destroy his own government than allow the vipers to claim another victim. Rachel's legacy, then, is a complicated one. She never served as First Lady. She never set foot in the White House. She never attended the ball. Her primary role in her husband's presidency was her absence, an absence that left a hole shaped like a grave, a void that was filled by her husband's limitless grief and his volcanic, vengeful rage. The role of official White House hostess fell to her niece, Emily Tennessee Donelson, who had been close to Rachel and had traveled to Washington with Jackson. But even Emily was not immune. When she, too, eventually sided with the cabinet wives and refused to socialize with Peggy Eaton, Jackson, in a fit of fury, banished his own niece, Rachel's niece, from the White House, sending her back to Tennessee. He would not compromise, not even for family. John Eaton, the man at the center of the petticoat affair, the man whose wife Jackson had defended as a surrogate for Rachel, remained Jackson's loyal friend. And it was Eaton who wrote the epitaph for Rachel's tombstone. It is perhaps the most fitting summary of her life, her tragedy, and Jackson's eternal anger. There is a striking, almost biblical parallel in Rachel's story. She, like her pioneer ancestors, had undertaken a perilous journey. It was a journey from the wilderness of the Tennessee frontier to what was for her husband the promised land, the presidency. It was a journey of hardship, of brutal personal attacks, and of profound pain. And in the end, like Moses, she was allowed to see that promised land. She stood on the mountaintop. She saw the victory, but she was never, ever allowed to enter it. Her life was defined by a legal mistake, a simple error on the wild frontier that, decades later, metastasized in the superheated, toxic atmosphere of national politics. She was a quiet woman who wanted only peace, but she was married to a loud man who lived for the fight. And in the end, the fight consumed her. The story of Rachel Jackson is a brutal, enduring reminder that in the savage theater of politics, the first casualties are often the innocent, and the deepest wounds are the ones inflicted not on the combatants, but on those they love.